Okay. All right, this prompt needs a little bit of explanation before you can do it. Oh, I did not. No. I am good. I'll give you my flower. Sometimes they'll come up here during the day and I'll give it to you. Okay. All right.
That feels wrong.
Sorry. All right. So there is a lot of talk in this book about entails. And it's that certain kind of property that goes down through like certain heirs, right? It can't go to just the firstborn child. It's like, okay, it has to go to a man in English society. And if it does not go to, if you do not have sons, then it might go to some cousin. And it's kind of like all predicted beforehand, before anybody dies. This entail has sort of like been mapped out, right? There is something called a linguistic entail. A linguistic entail is an if-then statement that sets up conditions. It works kind of like a property entail. It sets up conditions. If this is true, then this thing will be true. And I think that this book, just because of its genre, I think it sets up a lot of linguistic conditions, a lot of linguistic entails, as well as like the property entails, right? If you want to be happy in marriage, then you need to behave this way. If you have a bad first impression, then this is how things are going to turn out, etc. So what I want you to do on a piece of paper with just the normal people you work with, I want you to write 5 entails for this book. 5 linguistic entails, which again is just a fancy way of saying an if-then statement that you believe is true about this book. So sort of like conditions that Jane Austen sets up and how she solves them. All right, 5 of those. I want everyone to write them down, but I would like you to work in your group to come up with them. So we've got these linguistic entailments. We're going to use those here in a second. Let's talk about the actual literal entailment in this, the piece of property here that Mrs. Bennett is always talking about. So take out your books. Books in literature class. Oh, I see. You just forgot. And this is our last day with Pride and Prejudice, by the way. I'm not having you write an essay just on Pride and Prejudice. We're doing Streetcar Named Desire next, and then you can choose which one you're going to want to write about. So yeah, you have some choices for the next essay. Okay, so the entail, we first introduced the entail in chapter 7. So go to chapter 7. Very close to the beginning. Thought at least. Maybe I don't have the right page numbers for mine as usual. Let me make sure that I have the right. Okay, I think I have the wrong page numbers. 1 second, sorry. At some point I did this with a different book. Hang on, I got a third book.
Whatever you think. She doesn't answer.
Okay, yeah, beginning of chapter 7. First paragraph. Yeah, I need to combine my things. It's pretty ridiculous. Okay, so at the beginning of chapter 7, it says, Mr. Bennett's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of $2,000 a year, which unfortunately for his daughters, when it was entailed in default of heirs male on a distant relation, and their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. Her father had been an attorney in Meryton and had left her £4,000. So yeah.
A whole book of those, like my mom, this, my dad, this, nothing like that.
Right. And in fact, the fact that Mrs. Bennett's dad did have a job and was an attorney is like a little bit shameful for the family. Like they're just like, oh, he had to work for a living. So it's like the definition of old money, where things have been passed down to the point where you really shouldn't have to work. The only reason that you should, if you have status, the only reason you would work is at things that like are bringing sort of like more prestige to your estate. So work at collecting, work at potentially you could be in an attorney, but the jobs were very limited that would be seen as respectable at all.
So basically,
Yeah, by our standards for sure. We call them useless. I mean, I don't like them being that rich. In fact, let me show you a chart of how rich everyone is. Sorry, I'm a little bit scattered, but yeah, I got to show you this chart because it's in our terms. Oh, thank you so much. It's beautiful.
Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
I don't think we do.
Xander, do you want it?
Really nice.
It is. It's beautiful.
Like, seriously,
There you
are.
are.
Sure?
I am sure. I've never remembered to bring that home, and it's always dead the next day. So it is for you, my friend. That's so nice. Okay, so here's kind of how the money would be. So it says today, but this is probably 5 years old. So you can imagine a little bit more than this. So he's making this is kind of like interest. This is being passed down from him. 10,000 pounds annually is worth about $1 million a year. That is not including Pemberley. That's not including like all of the stuff that he already has. That is just what is coming in. Then you have Bingley, who has about half as much, so about $500,000 a year, but then he also inherited a bunch, and this chart sort of estimates that it's probably about $6 million inherited from his dad. All right, we've got Wickham, who is in debt, and this is how much that debt really is. So when they said that Darcy paid off his debt, that is the amount that Darcy would have been paying off. It ain't nothing. Mr. Collins will inherit a bunch, but for now he has one of these respectable jobs that we don't look down on, which is that he's in the clergy. He has a parish. So modest income from parish. I mean, I'm thinking it's probably around 180. Now, you know what? I bet it's around 80,000 a year is what they're calling a modest income compared to all of this. And then we've got Mr. Bennett, who is making a lot of money. Like, I don't know. I'll never make this much. So this is a ton of money, but when you compare it to Mr. Darcy, it's like nothing, right? So I think that's it. I think it's got to be a comparison. So it's not that Mr. Bennett, it's not that the Bennetts are poor, it's that they are poor compared to the people in their neighborhood. And you think about who just moved into their neighborhood, they're making about $500,000. So compared to everybody else, they are living modestly. But the main issue for them is that they know that once Mr. Bennett dies, none of this will be theirs anymore. The daughters, this will be what's entailed to Mr. Collins. The daughters won't get any of this. They get a sum from Mrs. Bennett, which I don't know the conversion rate for theirs, but that kind of gives you a sense of how the people are sort of like living. Okay. So that was a bit of a sidetrack. So the entail at the beginning of chapter 7, the little paragraph that I just read you, that comes directly from our narrator. That's nobody in the book is speaking about the entail at that section. So what would you say? We talked about the narrator having like different styles here: editorial, objective, omniscient, limited, etc. What would you say the style of narration is at the beginning of chapter 7? Like, let me ask this: what is the tone that the narrator takes towards the entail? I'm going to read it one more time. Mr. Bennett's property consisted almost entirely of an estate of $2,000 a year, which unfortunately for his daughters was entailed in the default of heirs male on a distant relation. And their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. So what do you think the narrator's tone is? Like, tone is attitude towards the subject, right? How does the narrator feel about the entail, judging just by the word choice in that little section? Abby? Yeah, okay, what seems to be the part that they don't like? Yeah, good. And I really like that word, unfortunately. What does, like, let's pick that apart a little bit more, because the narrator could have chosen a number of different ways to describe this. It could have been like devastatingly for his daughters or unfairly for his daughters. It's this word unfortunate. What does that suggest about an entail? Yeah.
That like it's kind of like it's really common, but it still sucks.
Yeah, it's kind of like this thing that's sort of like it's there, it's common, it's a matter of fortune, so it has nothing to do with how deserving someone is of money. It is just, this is the way it is, right? So I think that Abby's right that the narrator doesn't necessarily love the entail, but I also don't think that the narrator is fighting against it. Like in this section, you could say, hey, work, or the amount of money that you make should be dependent on the amount you work, which is like a lot of our American rhetoric, right? Or it could have been like, the daughters like really deserve to have this entail, but they're not getting it, and how unfair is that, and how sexist is that, and so on. Like the narrator could have provided, narrator does this throughout, like provided some editorializing about that entail, but the only thing that we get is that unfortunately, and it's like, yeah, sucks, but this is the way it is, right? So then let's compare that to when Mrs. Bennett talks about the entail. This is in chapter 12, nope, 13. Right before Mr. Collins' letter. Chapter 13, and the paragraph starts after amusing himself sometime. We got it? Okay. After amusing himself sometime with their curiosity, so Mr. Bennett has a letter and he's sort of like waving it in front of them. He thus explained, about a month ago, I received this letter, and about a fortnight ago, I answered it, for I thought it a case of some delicacy and required some attention. It is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. All right, so this is in contrast to the narrator's view of entailment. How does Mr. Bennett feel about the entailment? He's a little bit bitter, I think, and a little bit like, but he's taken like that ironic distance too. So he's bitter in the way of, it's like, man, this is like not fair for my girls, my daughters. And yet at the same time, he just makes a joke about it. He may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. Like Mr. Bennett has a really dark sense of humor about things. And Mrs. Bennet responds, "Oh, my dear," cried his wife, "I cannot bear to hear that mentioned. Pray do not talk of that odious man. I do think it is the hardest thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your own children. And I'm sure if it had been you, I should have tried long ago to do something or other about it." So Mrs. Bennet's attitude towards entails is way different than both Mr. Bennet's and the narrator's. I think Mr. Bennet's somewhat aligns with the narrator, although Mr. Bennet is more willing to joke about it. Mrs. Bennet's is different. How is Mrs. Bennet thinking about that entail? She's very upset. Yeah. Allison? And she's like, doesn't want it to exist. Like she wants to fight against it. Now, judging by how the narrator feels, unfortunately, but there it is. Same with Mr. Bennet. What do you think the book feels about Mrs. Bennet's attitude towards entailments? Yeah.
I think it's kind of like the narrator's trying to tell us that she's trying to fight a battle she's not.
Yeah, I think that's it. So do we feel then sad for Mrs. Bennet? We're just like, or are we like, I mean, sometimes that's the rebels' position. They're fighting a battle they're never going to win, like Les Mis, right? That's the play that's coming up. Like that's the whole thing about Les Mis is like celebrating these guys who are going to fight the battle that they never were going to win because it's so noble. Do we see Mrs. Bennet that way? And why not? Just look at the way that she words this here. I do think it is the hardest thing in the world your estate should be entailed away from your own children. I'm sure if I had been you, I should have tried long ago to do something or other about it. Yeah, Allison? Yeah, so she seems frazzled then, or like she doesn't have any kind of like plan. It's just to complain. Yeah.
Also, when she says, "I am sure if I had been you," like.
Yeah, and it's also like again an impossibility. And so she's just like, oh, it's unfair to not be a man. It's unfair. Like she's always complaining about the situation, right? I also think it's the hardest thing in the world. Is that the hardest thing in the world? Like you're literally saying that when you have people working at your house and they have good positions, like here they are, like working at the house.
Oh, sorry, has every girl received this? I got this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luke.
She's saying this and the book doesn't cover this at all, but they have servants that are working at their house, like polishing their silver and serving their meals. And even Mrs. Bennet is like really uptight about that when Mr. Collins is like, oh, thanks for the meal. She's like, oh, I'm sure I have people who cook. I would never let my daughters cook, right? And then in front of these people, supposedly she's saying, this is the hardest thing in the world, that you have to marry for your millions rather than just having your millions given to you, right? So I think there's a way that the narrator is sort of like recognizing some privilege in their situation, making fun of their situation a little bit. And when Mrs. Bennet is taking the entail a bit too seriously, or she's complaining too much about it, the narrator thinks she's a bit ridiculous. And then the next page, you get Mr. Collins' letter. And in Mr. Collins' letter, he is apologizing for the entail. It's like, disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late honored father always gave me uneasiness, and since I have had the misfortune to lose him, I have frequently wished to heal the breach. Blah, 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 blah. I have been so fortunate. Sorry, I'm looking for it. I flatter myself that my present overtures of goodwill are highly commendable, and that the circumstance of my being next in the entail of Longbourn Estate will be kindly overlooked on your side, and not lead you to reject the offered olive branch. I cannot be otherwise than concerned at being the means of injuring your amiable daughters, and beg leave to apologize for it, as well as to assure you of my readiness to make them every possible amends, but of this hereafter. So that's where he's saying, like, I am so sorry that this house has been entailed to me. All right, after everything we said about Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Bennet, and the narrator, how does the book feel about Mr. Collins' position towards the entail? Yeah.
He's kind of in this awkward situation where like he didn't like, this wasn't like his plan, but he was in that family line, so everyone
Yeah.
has different feelings, and he's like,
Okay, so if that's Mr. Collins' position, he might say something similar to the narrators, where he says something like, unfortunately, this has been entailed to me. But instead, we get these long sentences, and even when he comes to dinner, he has more apologies about this. And I'm so sorry, but I'll make it up to you. I'm so sorry about this. Does the narrator look kindly on those apologies and say, oh, like that's nice that he's apologizing for this? No, look at the next page. It says, he must be an oddity, I think, said she. This is Elizabeth. I cannot make him out. There is something very pompous in his style. And what can he mean by apologizing for being next in the intel? We cannot suppose he would help it if he could. Can he be a sensible man, sir? No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the reverse. There's a mixture of servility and self-importance in his letter, which promises well. I'm impatient to see him. So Mr. Bennet, again, who doesn't have a dog in this fight, who has his money and then he's going to die. So he had like a great life and then goodbye, right? He gets to have this fun of like sitting back and just watching Mr. Collins being ridiculous. And he says that it's a mix of servility and self-importance. Explain that to me. How can an apology have this mix of servility and self-importance? Yeah, Xander.
It's kind of like, he's a really nice guy. He's like, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna try to make sure this doesn't happen. But at the same time, he knows that he can do that.
Okay, good. So the servility is like this performance of the like manners, like saying like, oh, I'm so sorry. But like, he's not going to, even if he could, he wouldn't get rid of the entail. And Elizabeth can recognize that, right? Okay. Anything else about the apology, Allison?
He's asking them to like overlook the sale and saying like, I'm offering you this olive branch because I'm so
Right. And yet the entail is everything. The entail has become their entire life. The entail is the reason that they will marry in the way that they will marry. The entail is everything they talk about. The entail is like why Mr. Bennet has to go introduce himself to Mr. Bingley first, blah, 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 blah. It all stems from money. So for him to just be like, can we just overlook this and can we just be friends? It seems like really naive to everyone who is not going to inherit. Okay. And then one more thing I want us to look at, which is, well, you don't have to turn to this one, but another spot, Mrs. Bennet continues with this attitude towards the entail. She says, I cannot bear to think that they should have all this estate. If it was not for the entail, I should not mind it. What should you not mind? I should not mind anything at all. So Mrs. Bennet is just like, oh my gosh, if I just had some property, all of my problems would be solved. I wouldn't have to worry about anything else. And I think the book again sees this as ridiculous to even think about that as a possibility. There, Mrs. Bennet has a kind of linguistic entail where she says, if I had all the property in the world, right? If I were inheriting, or my daughters were inheriting, then I wouldn't have anything to worry about. The book doesn't necessarily agree with that entailment, or it says that this is inevitable. So why even think about those conditions? Okay, with that in mind, all that entailment stuff. Yes, go to that white page that I just handed out with the AP prompts on them. So it says, the first one says, in many works of fiction, houses take on symbolic importance. Such houses may be literal houses or unconventional ones, hotels, hospitals, monasteries, boats. Like I said last time, a few times ago, I had somebody write about the island in Lord of the Flies even. So like literally anything could be seen as a house or a home. Either from your own reading or from the list below, choose a work of fiction in which a literal or conventional house serves as a significant symbol. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze how this house contributes to an interpretation of the work as a whole. Do not merely summarize the plot. All right, I didn't mean to limit your choices here. You've got lots of houses you could talk about in Pride and Prejudice. You could talk about Pemberley. You could talk about Mr. Bingley's Netherfield. You could talk about Longbourn, the Bennet's house. You could talk about the house in London that Lydia and Wickham escaped to, an apartment, right? There are all these different houses in Pride and Prejudice. And wasn't it Xander at the beginning of this book was like, I heard all this book is people going and visiting each other at each other's houses. Yeah, I mean, it is, right? Is there any part of the book that doesn't fit into that?
I mean, I guess when Lydia runs away, but that's it.
Yeah, but we don't get to see her in her new spot in London. It's just they're talking about it as they visit each other's houses. Yeah, yeah. So this book, it was definitely on the list. This book would be the perfect book for this prompt. I'm gonna give you now, I'm gonna time it, give you 3 minutes to write a thesis statement. So remember, a thesis needs to have the theme, right? So something generalizable about the book, something about, or something generalizable about like human nature. And then it's got to have some sort of characteristics that the book has in order to build up that theme, some sort of literary characteristics. Okay, give it a shot, 3 minutes, and then we're gonna put them on the board. All right, little mini workshop, just share it with a partner. You have an odd number though. We do, you 3 over there. Okay, everybody else share it with one person. I want you to give them a piece of feedback. You give them a positive and a negative. Let's do that. Give them a positive piece of feedback, but make sure to give them some constructive criticism. Okay.
Mine's just very short. So Just don't wear all black.
So you can use Tasha. That's pretty funny.
Here's, I really like.
That's a good choice.
No, I didn't know it was that chunky. I mean,
Okay, we're gonna do a couple more of these. So for this first one, I'm gonna have you three and Huck come on up and put your thesis statement up on the board. Yeah. Just wherever it can fit. Yeah. Great. Okay, we're gonna start with mine. In Pride and Prejudice, so one thing I want to point out, because I'm grading your timed essays right now, book titles and MLA, you underline it. And you capitalize it. Capitals will probably that will annoy some English teachers. So definitely make sure to capitalize it. I don't think you'll be penalized for the underline versus quotations thing, but let's impress them with correct MLA. So when you're typing, it's in italics. When you're writing, it's underlined for book titles. Same with play titles. Poems are in quotation marks. Everything else we read in here is underlined or italics. Okay. In Pride and Prejudice, inherited houses symbolize stability, showing that marriage is a permanent financial agreement that solidifies the upper class. So my theme here is right here, what marriage is. It's this kind of truth about a human institution. So it's not just specific to this book. In fact, women authors right at the time were basically all have this theme about it being a financial agreement. What I like about my thesis is this idea of solidification and inherited, because in this paper, I'm gonna be able to talk about how Bingley rents a house and how that's not as good as Pemberley. And I'm gonna talk about Lydia and Wickham being in London and the impermanence of that situation and why that was so troubling to them. And so I like that part of it. I think that my theme could be a little bit more interesting, but I'm hoping in my paper I'm going to make it more interesting. That's sort of my. Any other constructive? You could feel free. Any other constructive criticism for this one? What could we critique about this? Yeah, Allison. Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, there could be some other literary quality in here. I could be talking about imagery or description, or I could be talking about the juxtaposition between inherited versus not inherited property, etc. And I could be a little bit more specific there. Okay, let's read. Yeah, Xander.
I was gonna say solidifies. Slightly more specific.
I know. I was trying to think of a different word, but instead of stabilize, I agree. This could be a word choice issue. I'm not sure yet though, because I was thinking about it in those 3 minutes, so I couldn't think of a better one. Okay, great. Then let's read all the other thesis statements. Houses reflect a person's personality, which can be seen through Pemberley and how it shows who Mr. Darcy really is. In Pride and Prejudice, we're going to fix every much them all. In Pride and Prejudice, Pemberley is a symbol of how outward appearances can contrast what is inside. In the Bennet's entailment in Pride and Prejudice represents the girl's responsibility to gain money/power, and how when money is not given to you, you must find other ways to obtain it. The Bennet home is a symbol for the start of a journey. Jane Austen uses repetitive returns to this house before big changes are made to represent the human urge to go back to where you came from. I think that's just a little. The human urge to go back where you came from. Okay, what I want you to do is, if you did not write a thesis statement, you're gonna come on up and you're gonna vote for the best one. Don't vote for mine, even though I know mine is the best. But yeah, vote for somebody's, one of your classmates. Just put a little tally next to the one you think is the best. Go ahead.
I need to like read it.
Everyone's gonna have their thesis statement voted on, I think, at time, so. It's a serious business, not just pick one, carefully decide.
Thought about it, but
Okay, now let's take a look at that one more carefully. So just because it's the best doesn't mean it can't be better, because it was under a time limit, right? So the Bennet home is a symbol for the start of a journey. Jane Austen uses repetitive returns to this house before big changes are made to represent the human urge to go back to where you come from. So what did we like about this thesis? Allison? I agree. I really like that it's got these 2 things too, that they can focus on throughout the paper. Awesome. It's something other than like about. I agree. It's a really unique theme. I think this theme is going to stand out. I have never thought actually about the fact that they're constantly returning to the family home. That's fascinating. So it's this thing that I haven't thought about with the book. It's something that not everybody is going to write about. So that would be exciting. Anything else about this one that we like? Okay, those stand out to us, which is awesome, because those are the 2 parts of the thesis that you need, the literary qualities and the theme, you know? So what could be improved about this thesis statement? Ash?
Wording,
I agree. I wonder if you even need this in a thesis. You know, you could probably talk about this in the paper when you're talking about like a turning point in the book, but what if you just had And I know it adds some literary qualities, but what if we just had uses repetitive returns to this house to represent? Would we lose too much? I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it would be okay. I do see why it's a point about structure in the book. So it's something that you would want to talk about in the paper because it's interesting. I just don't know you need it in the thesis. Okay, anything else we want to change? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the human urge to go back to where you came from, return to your origin. Wow, you're on one. I give you a rose, Xander.
Hey, I'm just saying, English teachers, it's just a little bit too much.
Yeah, I get that.
Origins.
I get that. I was just thinking, I just didn't want to end with a preposition.
No, it's not you. I just believe that all English teachers.
It's not you, it's just everything you represent and chosen to do with your life.
Basically.
Okay, awesome, but I agree, this is a really great thesis, not that any of them were bad. The one thing I would change about this one, this is just a tiny little thing, but I see slashes sometimes in your paper, just use the word and. If you're saying or and, like you gotta decide which one, because it's really important to your argument. Using the slash sometimes is to get away from that hard decision. So no slashes in formal writing. Okay, awesome. Let's talk about another thing. And then we'll do another thesis. And I don't know which book this one's in. Ridiculous. Okay, I think the entailment is a sign of a bigger issue in this book. At the very beginning of when we started reading this, I told you that this was during the Regency period, which was right sort of like after some really important Enlightenment books came out. One of those books that was very popular and made like a big splash among like academic circles, but also just among like the upper classes that were reading this kind of thing, including probably Jane Austen's family, was a book called The Critique of Pure Reason. All right, you still have your entailment sheets out, right? Take some notes. So this is a book by a guy named Immanuel Kant. And in this, he's talking about like how we make decisions, basically. And Pride and Prejudice is a book entirely about how we make really important life decisions. So I do think that this is an important thing to kind of like understand about the way they were thinking about our ability to reason and our ability to feel and how we should prioritize those two things. So number one, in this book, Kant says that there is a bunch of knowledge, some knowledge that is what's called a priori. Anyone know what that word means, a priori? Basically, it means blank slate. So we are born, no, it doesn't mean blank slate. It means that we have knowledge before, like we're set on knowledge before we were born. So at first, it's like we are born with certain, he called them categories of understanding. Okay, not that it totally matters, but he says that those categories of understanding are spatial and temporal. So we are born with a sort of idea of what it means for items to exist in space and for ourselves to exist in space. And we are born with a concept of how time moves, like a chronology. So he says those are the two things that we are like born into this world with. But I think if we were to think about a priori knowledge in Pride and Prejudice, remember how this book starts. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And then we discussed the entailment. So what are some things that are a priori before we start the plot of this book? Yeah. Yeah. So let's put this as a spatial and temporal issue. Get married, because there's a certain timeline that you need to get married, that you need to perform events, and there is also a certain like class of person in like sort of relation to you that you need to marry. Anything else that the book sets up is just this is a priori? Yes,
It's like
Okay, good. So your purpose of life equals money and marriage, and we're not quite sure the order. Like, we don't know if marriage is supposed to get you money or money is supposed to get you marriage. It's some sort of like, yeah, it could be either or, but the purpose is some combination of those two things. Yeah. Anything else about that we enter this novel a priori, we know that this is a condition? I think part of the entailment is that property equals male, and relationships equal women. Not totally relationships, but property equals male. And I think that's something that this book is not necessarily fighting against. There are moments where it's critical about it, like it's like, that's unfortunate, right? But I wouldn't necessarily say this book is like this big feminist statement about why that's unfortunate, because at the end, it all works out for all of them, to just marry into the money. So I think that's a priori condition, right? So that's why we get this narrator just saying like, this is a truth universally acknowledged. This is unfortunate, but this is true. Like, you just need to accept these conditions. There is a second way that we get knowledge. Which is through experience. And that's where most knowledge comes from. And this is where we could consider all of those and linguistic entailments that you guys wrote. If you do this, then you can experience something a certain way. It's like the if-then statement is a priori. It's this like set in temporal structure, like you have to know that things just have this causal relationship with each other. But through experience, you can determine what is the right way to do things, what is sort of like the moral way to do things. So as we have experience, though, we learn about the world in two ways. One, we learn through sensibility, which is what we feel. According to Kant, to use his term, sensible is an interesting word. And Kant, in his book, felt like this was passive knowledge. You can't help the way you feel. He didn't believe in that, like, feed the wolf thing. He said, do you guys know what I mean when I said that? Sorry, that fell on. There was a YouTube video for a while that was like, if you feed the wolf negative thoughts, then the wolf gets hungrier for those negative thoughts, but you can be positive. Anyway, so he didn't believe that you could just like think your way into happiness or think your way into sadness. He says this is just passive knowledge. You can't change the way you feel. You can't help the way you feel. So you're going to have certain reactions to things, and they're kind of immediate, and it's like based on your senses. So if you smell a rose, you can't help if you're going to like that smell or not. If you have a first impression from somebody and they are rude to you, you can't help the way that you feel in relation to that. If somebody says, oh, you're ugly, and you feel bad about it, like that's natural. Yeah. You're like, well, Immanuel Kant says that this is knowledge from sensibility and I can't help it. Yeah, sure. Yeah, but he also thinks that there's another kind of knowledge, which is understanding. So our knowledge through experience comes from sensibility, but it is also through understanding. And he says that this is what we think. And this kind of knowledge is active. Kant might say you could just eat the mushrooms anyway because you know that someone made them for you and that's the kind of thing to do, or you know that they're good for you or whatever. You could think your way into having that understanding. So that means you can change. You can change the way you think. All right, so let's look at when Elizabeth changes the way she thinks. This is in chapter 36, or if you have volumes, volume 2, chapter 13, XIII. So chapter 36 or volume 2, chapter 13. Okay. This chapter represents when Elizabeth gets new information about Darcy in the letter, And she goes through the process of kind of changing her mind about Darcy. And we see the way her mind works, and we see the way that the sensibility and the understanding are interacting in this section. So what I want you to do on that same piece of paper, but also with your same groups or your same partners, I want you to go through and find moments when she is making choices or thinking about her feelings, and moments when her rationality is coming in and changing her mind. So you're finding, let's say you find 3 quotations that express her feelings and 3 quotations that show her reasoning through her response. And you don't need to write the full quotation, just write the first couple of words so that you can kind of see how it lays out. Okay, I'm going to give you a few minutes to do this. Do you understand what you're doing for it? Okay. Hey.
So they're going to stage 1 and 2.